I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Good evening and welcome. I am Jeff Donner, and it is my pleasure to be able to introduce for you our 16th annual celebration of the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In past years, we have endeavored to take the thorniest issues that have occurred in the preceding year and to analyze them in terms of Dr. King's teachings, statements, and writings. We tried to make sense out of what had happened in those years, and we've also tried to discern a way forward. And tonight will be no different, because we are exploring the concept of systemic racism in America today, taking a look at this concept through multiple views. But what is systemic racism? It's a term that we hear very frequently, but many of us may not understand what it means. Tonight, we will use the definition provided by Ibram X. Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And although this is a very complex topic, I think for tonight's conversations, we can distill it down to this. Our institutions are systemically racist when they do not provide equality of outcome. And in Professor Kendi's outlook, we have two categories where all actions fall into. The anti-racist category, in which everything that provides equality of outcome is anti-racist, and the racist category, in which everything that does not provide equality of outcome is racist. Systemic racism is not, however, traditional racism or individual racism, as Professor Kendi calls it. That is bigotry, hate, and even violence arising from disparities or differences in racial characteristics. That, unfortunately, is with us in this country today. It is reprehensible, it is abhorrent, it is unacceptable, and it needs to be stamped out wherever it may be found and wherever it may lurk. That is not what we're talking about tonight. Tonight, systemic racism, or as Dr. Kendi refers to it occasionally, institutional racism, or even racist policy, will be examined in several areas, including economics, law enforcement, and considering whether race, a social construct, can be eclipsed altogether, where individuals stop defining themselves by race. These topics are admittedly controversial. And as Brett Weinstein, a prominent evolutionary biologist, has said, they are fraught with danger. There may be positions taken or even questions asked that you do not like tonight. Perhaps you may even be angered by them, but that is not our purpose. We need to be able to discuss even the most controversial topics in a civil and respectful manner, even where we may disagree. This is an essential if we are to understand one another and preserve our bonds as citizens, as Americans. The views expressed tonight will be those of the individual speakers who make them. They are not necessarily the views of Congregation Torat L, Second Baptist Church of Long Branch, or Living Word Christian Fellowship, who are presenting this program. Our purposes are to inform and entertain, and to demonstrate that we can have civil and respectful discussion of these issues. We aim to provide you, our audience, with information from multiple views so that you can make up your own minds. We will do that through our two very compelling speakers, RAsheda Young and Thomas Chatterton Williams, who will be analyzing the concept of systemic racism from their distinct viewpoints. After that, we will have a panel discussion to discuss topics that they have raised and additional topics as well. Throughout our program, we will have our usual lively and entertaining choir presentations tonight from Living Word Christian Fellowship. And Our panel will be introduced and our speakers will be introduced more thoroughly as we get to each presentation. At the end of our program, Rabbi Aaron Schoenbrunn, the spiritual leader of Congregation Torat, will sum up in a presentation entitled Understanding the Issues and the Way Forward. I'd like to close my introduction with a reference to Dr. King. Dr. King's faith in America, the American people, and the arc of justice, which may bend slowly but somehow always manages to get there, made him not only a great American, but made him a great world citizen. His viewpoints and philosophies are not relevant only, are relevant not only for race relations, but they form a template as to how we can deal with each other as citizens. And so let us have the courage of Dr. King, as well as the patience and respect for each other to address these issues. Let us have the flexibility to consider new information and views so that we may better understand each other and ourselves. I want to thank B'nai Sholom Bethel Foundation for a generous grant without which we would not be able to present this program. And they have been with us from day one, year one, right through year 16. Pam Cardullo, our executive director at Torat, Lori Gross, our congregation president, Andy Robbins, an executive board member, Jerry Russell, my co-chair, and of course, Rabbi Schoenbrunn, Pastor Miller, the spiritual leader of Living Word Christian Fellowship, our guest speakers, Pastor John Chisholm, who directs the Living Word Choir, and of course, you, our audience, for being here tonight. Reverend Gibson, who's been a mainstay of our program for many years and the spiritual leader of Second Baptist Church, is recovering from surgery tonight. And so he will not be with us. And we pray for his speedy recovery. And we say to Pastor Gibson, hurry up and get well and come on back to us. We miss you. Now, let's take a balanced look at systemic racism through multiple views. Our first speaker, RAsheda Young, is a full-time instructor for Rutgers University writing program. In addition to her role as a teacher, she's an active member of the department's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Most recently, she has participated in and helped organize virtual workshops centered on anti-racist pedagogy. She also teaches a writing course at New York University. In addition to teaching for Rutgers University and New York University, she was also a full-time faculty member for the college writing program at Farley Dickinson University, where she served in various capacities, including Director of African American Studies. RAsheda Young's scholarship focuses on using play as an instructional strategy to humanize online learning experiences. Her scholarship has been presented at the internationally esteemed Conference on College Composition and Communication, the NYU Literary Review, and TYCA. She has been a featured speaker for the Graduate Language and Literacy Program at the City College of New York and Farley Dickinson University. Currently, she is a PhD student studying writing composition and applied linguistics. Her research interests are anti-racist pedagogy, translingualism, and rhetorical genre studies. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you RAsheda Young.
Thank you so much for that very warm welcome, Jeff. Thank you to Rabbi Schoenbrunn. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Thank you to also to our esteemed panelists, Pastor Miller, Thomas Chatterton, and I want to thank Shane, and I'm going to do my best. Skalrek. If I butcher that, please accept my apology. But I want to thank you for your patience, for your insight in technology, and I do sincerely thank you. So I am a teacher through and through, and as a teacher, I have a PowerPoint presentation prepared for you, and I want to jump right in. So I've titled this speech on wishing I was free, race in 2021. We are going to begin our discussion by looking at James Baldwin. This is a clip that the clip is, "I am not your Negro," right? And this was featured, actually, this clip comes from the Dick Cavett show, and this was in 1968. So let's watch this all together.
I would like to add someone to our group here. Professor Paul Weiss, a Sterling Professor of Philosophy at Yale. Were you able to listen to the show backstage?
I heard a good deal of it, but then I was behind the rostrum here.
Yes.
So I heard only some of it.
Did you hear anything that you disagreed with?
I disagreed with a great deal of it. And of course, there's a good deal I agree with. But I think he's overlooking one very important matter, I think. Each one of us, I think, is terribly alone. He lives his own individual life. There's all kinds of obstacles in the way of religion or color or size or shape or lack of ability. And the problem is to become a man.
Well, what I was discussing was not that problem, really. I was discussing the difficulties, the obstacles, the very real danger of death thrown up by the society when a black man attempts to become a man.
All this emphasis upon black man and white does emphasize something which is here, but it emphasizes it or perhaps exaggerates it, and therefore makes us put people together in groups which they ought not to be in. I have more in common with a black scholar than I have with a white man who's against scholarship. And you have more in common with a white author than you have with someone who's against all literature. So why must we always concentrate on color or religion or this? There are other ways of connecting men.
I'll tell you this. When I left this country in 1948, I left this country for one reason only, one reason. I didn't care where I went. I might have gone to Hong Kong. I might have gone to Timbuktu. I ended up in Paris, on the streets of Paris, with $40 in my pocket on the theory that nothing worse could happen to me there than it already happened to me here. You talk about making it as a writer by yourself. You have to be able then to turn off all the antenna with which you live, because once you turn your back on this society, you may die. You may die. And it's very hard to sit at a typewriter and concentrate on that if you're afraid of the world around you. The years I lived in Paris did one thing for me. They released me from that particular social terror, which was not the paranoia of my own mind, but a real social danger visible in the face of every cop, every boss, everybody. I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only include what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know, as Malcolm X once put it, that the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means that I can't afford to trust most white Christians and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby is anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen.
So I thought that this was interesting to begin with, and that was in 1968. On to Frantz Fanon, who is a French West Indian psychiatrist and political philosopher from the French colony of Martinique. And he says, sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong. When they are presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable called cognitive dissonance. And because it is so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit in with the core belief. Cognitive dissonance. It is so important to protect the core belief. So let's look at schema. Exactly what is that? Well, first, schema is a pattern of thought or behavior that organizes categories or information and the relationships. And sometimes the racial hierarchies are reproduced in part by hegemonic interpretive schema. So what does all that mean? Schema essentially is your thought pattern and the way in which you think and look at things to produce an idea. So here we have two images. This took place in 2015 in Texas. On the left, we have a young Black girl in a bathing suit. They were at a party, they were getting too loud. The neighbor called, and we see here on the left what happened, right? This is in Texas, 2015. Also in Texas, 2015, we have an image that is considered to date the deadliest motorcycle brawl in current history. And this is in Texas in 2015. 8 people died. Well, let's see. Let's look at the two images. This is not me interpreting. This is just looking at the images. Here we have a young Black girl, 15 years old, in a bathing suit being thrown to the ground. She committed no crime. On the right, we have the gang members on their cell phone. And then we have yellow tape. The yellow tape is caution. They are behind the yellow tape. And we have a police officer who looks to be protecting those who are standing behind the police tape. It is considered the deadliest motorcycle gang brawl in contemporary history. Not my words. This is what the picture tells us. We're also going to look at 2 different images, one that occurred in 2020 at a Black Lives Matter protest, where we have the National Guard called in to protect a monument, Abraham Lincoln, right? On the right, we have those who the media refers to as insurrectionists, who are attacking the Capitol on January 6th. There is not the same police presence as it was at the Black Lives Matter protest in June 2020. But we know that the concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis. It is completely made up. And this is according to Craig Venter. He is a pioneer of DNA sequencing, and he presented this talk in Washington, DC. So we know that the concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis. Actually, they say that chimpanzees have more in common, chimpanzees and humans have more in common than others, but yet we have this idea as though race, if one person is white or if one person is Black, one is better than the other. Now, who is this guy? So this guy, his name is Peter Camper, he was around from like 1722 to 1789. Now, we just said that race has there's no scientific evidence that shows that there is any type of difference between Black and whites. However, Peter Camper, he came up on the right, you will see it's called craniometric. And this is a machine that was used to measure the skull. And through the measurement of the skull, he was able to discern and justify racial differences and racial classifications. So whites were at the top, Blacks were at the bottom. And this contraption he is credited with this contraption. And this is what he used to measure skulls. Why show this? I show this because this was considered science. And based upon this quote, science, this was used to justify that whites were considered superior and Blacks were inferior. Oh, Dr. Samuel Cartwright. He was around between 1793 and 1863. And so he coined this term, drapetomania. Drapetomania is supposed to be a disease, a mental illness for Blacks who tried to escape from slavery. So if a Black person tried to escape from slavery, they were mentally challenged. They had drapetomania. And this again was in a scientific journal, and this was considered to be factual. Can you imagine? So how is it actually used? If race is a social construct, then how is it used? Well, this man, his name is Dr. Marion Sims. And Marion Sims, he is credited with being the father of gynecology. But let me tell you about this guy. What he did is that he performed dangerous procedures on Black women without giving them anesthesia. Many of the women that he did these procedures on, they died as a result of his, quote, science. But what Dr. Sims was and the thing about it, he wasn't even a full-fledged doctor. He did not complete med school. But yet he is credited with being the father of medicine, and the reason why he did not use anesthesia, according to medical apartheid, is that he believed that, quote, Black women were stronger. Black women could bear the brunt of these surgeries and these procedures without having anesthesia. And he marveled at how many of them died. I mean, can you imagine? So here we are using race, which again does not exist, in order to promulgate racist ideologies. And this is Dr. quote, quote, Marion Sims. So the idea is like, well, where do we go from here? Before we get to where do we go from here, I also want to continue talking about some of the things that are currently going on in our contemporary times of how race is used. Well, we just finished talking about medical apartheid. Also, we need to look at education, and we need to look at the ways in which our schools are set up. I taught in an impoverished area. And if you are familiar at all with Jonathan Kozol's work, Savage Inequalities, in it, he describes horrid conditions that these students have to go to, that they go to school in. I firsthand had that experience. I know what it is like when children do not have the supplies that they need. I know what it is like. I'm trying to talk to you all. I know what it is like when children do not have the tools that they need because of the color of their skin. Well, how can you say it's because of the color of their skin? Well, we know statistically that Blacks, by and large, earn less than whites. Is that because of racism? Don't know. We also know that those who go to urban schools, that they have less access to quality equipment. I know that firsthand. I also know firsthand that when we look at the difference between urban schools and suburban schools, I've taught in both, there is a significant difference between the access that our students in inner cities have versus those who are in suburban areas. This is not something made up. I live this firsthand. We also know, going back to what James Baldwin said in 1968, that the loaning practices are still discriminatory, even though progress has been made. Blacks still suffer greatly in terms of discriminatory practice. The mortality rate for Blacks is also higher. However, what is current now is the racial resentment that is building in America's heartland. I was looking for the book so I can reference it for you. But now we have those whites, according to Jonathan Mezzle of Dying of Whiteness. He says that whites will, in the heartland, according to his scholarship, would defer, or rather not have medical, or let me get it. He says that whites in the heartland have such strong affinity for racial identity that instead of taking or subscribing to the Obamacare or benefit, or Obamacare is what he talks about particularly, that instead they will bypass it because no, Obamacare is not for me, that's for them, even though it would benefit them. So the racial resentment in the heartland of our country, according to his scholarship, is such that they are dying of whiteness in terms of a pathology, in terms of a way of thinking. And the way that W.E.B. Du Bois describes whiteness, he says that whiteness, again, we're looking at pathology, we're looking at thought processes, and we're looking at schema. He says in The Souls of White Folks that whiteness entails a passionate belief in one's right to everything and anything. Du Bois believes there is no difference between the skin color of Blacks and whites. However, he's saying that whites have this idea as though they are entitled to both land and to people, which one might say, we can attribute that back to one of the images earlier in the slideshow of those, the insurrectionists on January 6th feeling entitled. So the idea of whiteness, according to his research, Derek Bell, Cheryl Harris, all of these scholars are saying that whiteness, the mentality of whiteness, is one in which it says, I own, you are less than. So let's move forward from the idea of whiteness, the idea of ownership, the idea of property ownership, and the ways in which race is still being used now. We know about police brutality. We know about Say Her Name. We know about various, we know about Sandra Bland. We know about George Floyd. We know these names, but yet cognitive dissonance for some of us says, well, that person must have been doing something. I'm going to tell you what that person was doing. That person was being Black. So what are we fighting? Where do we go from here? Knowing that the ways in which, particularly from 1968, going back to the 18th century, we have science that says Blacks are inferior. We have current scholarship, as well as dated scholarship that says, hey, listen, there is no difference between Blacks and whites. What do we do with that information? Well, Dr. Joy DeGree Leary, a scholar who wrote Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, who did extensive research in South Africa, says the significant difference between those, post-apartheid in South Africa versus Jim Crow here is that they actually talk about it. They actually provide platforms in Rwanda, post-genocide. They have days where once a month, neighbors, Hutu, Tutsi, they have, well, even though you can't say either of those terms now, but they make it a point to have reconciliation. They remember. And what happens, unfortunately, in this country is the idea that it does not exist. Well, we just saw that it did. We just saw what happened on January 6th, where you had insurrection, you had those who were attacking the Capitol who were not treated in the same way that those who were protesting peacefully. So what we can do is that we can continue to have dialogue. We can continue to have these platforms. And we no longer have to wonder, hopefully, we don't have to wonder what it's like to be free, because we'll know how it feels to be free. So I want to thank everyone for your time, for your attention. I again want to thank the organizers of this, and I hope that I have given you something to think about how science was used to justify hegemonic practices under the guise that Blacks are inferior, although science shows there isn't any significant difference between Blacks and whites. So I'm going to imagine that I hear you clapping right now, and I want to say thank you very much for your time.
Our first selection from the Living Word Christian Fellowship Choir. I first came across this song in a Second Baptist Long Branch hymnal as I participated in a service with the Second Baptist Church congregation. And I was thumbing through the hymnal book, and I saw this song, and I knew it was very, very special from the very first moment. I'd now like to introduce the Living Word Christian Fellowship Choir, directed this evening by Pastor John Chisholm, in their presentation of Lift Every Voice and Sing. I want to thank that wonderful performance from Living Word Christian Fellowship, Lift Every Voice and Sing. And now it's time to present our second speaker of the evening, who will have some distinct views of his own on the issue of systemic racism. His name is Thomas Chatterton Williams, and Thomas is the best-selling author of Self-Portrait in Black and White and Losing My Cool. Thomas Chatterton Williams is an American cultural critic, contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, and columnist at Harper's. His essays and reporting have appeared in The New Yorker, the London Review of Books, Vanity Fair, The Atlantic, Le Monde, and many other publications. His book, Losing My Cool, Love, Literature, and the Black Man's Escape from the Crowd, is a provocative, intellectual coming-of-age memoir about juggling two disparate lifestyles, one rooted in the allure and danger of performative street culture, the other in the saving grace of literature and the power of the bond between father and son. His latest book, Self-Portrait in Black and White, is a reckoning with how we see and define ourselves and each other in America and beyond, expanding on his Virginia Quarterly Review essay, Black and Blue and Blonde. In this beautifully written book, drawing on his personal experience as the Black father of two white-looking children in Paris, Williams disputes the notion that what we call race should be central to his identity or anyone else's. Williams is also one of the writers of the Harper's Open Letter, a letter on justice and open debate, which was signed by 153 prominent writers and intellectuals. He was a National Fellow at New America in 2019, and he was the recipient of a Berlin Prize from the American Academy. He is a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and lives in Paris with his family. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you with great pleasure, Thomas Chatterton Williams.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, and thank you all for being here and for taking the time. And thank you, RAsheda, for that talk and the wonderful performance we just witnessed. It's an honor to be here today speaking to you as we commemorate the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. It's also an extraordinarily important time in America to be thinking about such topics as race, as our country's collective past, and as our shared path forward into what I sincerely hope will be a better tomorrow in this first month of transition from the extraordinarily polarized era of Donald Trump. One of the first things I tend to think about when I think about the struggle that so many went through so that we could all be free and equal, like many of you, I'm sure, one of the first things that pops into my mind is the face of Martin Luther King, Jr. It's just a reflexive thought. I think of Black history, or I think of the civil rights movement, and I see Martin Luther King. Usually I see him in black and white. I see him in my mind in a kind of grainy resolution. He's addressing the mall in Washington, telling the people gathered there about his dream. Or I see him stepping out onto the balcony of his hotel that fateful day in Memphis, the weight of the world on his shoulders, his face serious and thoughtful, sometimes creased with worry. In my mental portrait of him, he becomes kind of this embodiment or personification of struggle, virtue, and forbearance. He seems beyond me and absolutely out of my reach. It's almost as if he's of another species, a higher and better species. So the other day it stopped me in my tracks when I came across a photograph of him that shows him in a different way than I had ever imagined. The photograph is undated, but I'm sure it's from the 60s because Dr. King looks very much the way he did toward the end of his life. He's young, but no longer such a young man. It's safe to assume that at the time the photo was taken, he was under extraordinary pressure and that he was feeling the burden of leading a movement that was fighting for its life and really for all of our lives. And yet in this photo, you cannot tell any of that. In this photo, Dr. King is perched on the edge of a billiards table. He's surrounded by a crowd of onlookers, all men of varying ages, and he's holding a pool stick behind his back, getting ready to execute a difficult off-balance shot. The smile on his face is wide and happy, even relaxed. And the men who are watching him are smiling and laughing too, as they wait to see if he can pull it off. There's absolutely nothing in this picture to alert you to the fact that Dr. King and the men who surround him are fighting for their lives. For that moment, at least, they are happy and full of joy. In this picture, Dr. King is not a saint or a symbol, but a man, a fully human man capable of attempting a funny-looking behind-the-back shot on a billiards table and tossing his head back in laughter. I tell you all this because seeing this picture complicated my understanding of what I thought I knew, not just about Dr. King, but about that whole historical moment in America. And it reminded me that more often than not, it is the case that even what we think we know about the past, we don't really know in full. And the complex texture of those lives and struggles can never be merely boiled down to the preferences and preoccupations of the present moment. And so it is our duty to keep trying to get as full a picture as possible, always. And that thought struck me as an appropriate lesson to keep in mind as I prepare to talk to you today. I don't think it's an exaggeration, or it isn't much of one, to say that there is currently in this country a real crisis of history and of historical understanding. I don't mean to say that we don't constantly invoke the past or consult the historical record whenever possible. With the ease of a Google search, we do that today more than ever before. We throw historical references around, often to eschew the much harder work of really scrutinizing what is distinct about today. What I mean is that it seems every time you turn on the television, consult Twitter, or open the newspaper, there's another instance of history being obscured, of the past being smoothed over or redacted, and of historical events being reduced, misunderstood, or twisted in the service of polemical expediency, accusation, or self-flattery. And this is dangerous for the present. On the political landscape, on the one hand, we have avoided the worst. Our democracy was pushed to the breaking point under Donald Trump, but it did not snap. America struggled with itself in a bitterly contested election in which both candidates received more votes than had ever been cast for a single candidate in the history of the land. And I'll be honest, the better version of America won, barely. It's not a perfect America, certainly not an America that is beyond our vigorous critique, but the version of the country through which we can continue to work to achieve our more perfect union, at the very least, in good faith, was not defeated. I believe this and much more is evidence of real progress on the racial front from the time that picture was taken of Dr. King playing pool. And yet, on the other hand, there really does remain a significant and stubborn portion of the population that will not stop challenging this progress, that will not stop contending that democracy itself is suspect, that the election was somehow stolen, that the fewer people able to vote, the better, and that when those other people somehow do manage to cast their ballots, then their very presence in the electoral process is a form of getting over. And when all objections and challenges were dismissed in court, some went so far as to attempt to overturn a free and fair election by force. Even something so basic as the historical awareness that precisely what makes our society superior to others that came before it, that what makes it one to be proud of and one worth fighting for, is and has always been the peaceful transfer of power between administrations when the people, our conception of whom, of course, over the centuries and decades has expanded, when the people have come together and chosen their head of state. It's understandable. It can feel good to ignore a complicated reality and to bask instead in the simple pleasures of self-righteous outrage and victimization. We are all increasingly incentivized to do this. At the same time, so bombarded are we all now by contradictory opinions and deliberate disinformation, and so flimsy has our relationship to fact and the pursuit of truth become, that our handle on even the very recent past is often under direct assault. Perhaps nothing better illustrates the current American confusion with history, and with race too, than recent debates around free speech. We have encountered arguments from both the left and the right that seek to stifle an opponent's ability to express a viewpoint when it is expedient, without taking seriously Rosa Luxemburg's admonition that freedom is always and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently. A freedom secured on the unfreedom or exclusion of others is no freedom at all, nor is a freedom that is rooted in membership within one or another given identity group at a given time. Some have gone so far as to imply or even state explicitly that free speech itself is a form of racism or white supremacy. I encountered this directly over the past several months, since 4 other writers and myself organized and published a letter on justice and open debate in Harper's last July. The letter was signed by over 150 writers and intellectuals from across the political spectrum, from Noam Chomsky and Salman Rushdie and Cornel West on the left to Francis Fukuyama and David Frum on the right. One of the main motivations for me in championing the need for tolerance, open-mindedness, and allegiance to free expression in the face of a growing culture of safetyism, filter bubbles, and censoriousness was the simple understanding that minorities and historically oppressed groups are most protected in social contexts and environments that are open, flexible, and free, not intolerant or closed. Free speech, after all, is the foundation for all of our other rights. If we did not enjoy the freedom to write, speak, publish, assemble, and protest, as Susan Nossel, the CEO of PEN America, writes, then the great movements for reproductive freedom, racial justice, environmental accountability, immigrants' rights, and other essential causes would be hamstrung. The protected power of expression, assembly, and persuasion formed the basis of the civil rights movement. We must never forget. Justice Louis Brandeis, the first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court, and himself a target of anti-Semitic attacks, argued a century ago that even though opportunities to speak and be heard are certainly not equally distributed, the best solution to objectionable speech is nonetheless more speech in order to refute it, dismantle it, and condemn it. More speech exposes and discredits bad speech and promotes a vision of equality and justice in its place. Or as one of the hundreds of self-described regular people who wrote me in response to the letter put it, no one has ever explained to me how, as a Black man without wealth or social capital, it's in my best interest to put limits on what can be thought and said. And yet there is an argument growing in strength that truth and objectivity are themselves illusory systems of oppression, and that uninhibited free speech, far from a defensive weapon for the vulnerable and a means of correcting the record or speaking truth to power, is nothing but a tool wielded by conservatives, racists, and white nationalists to spread their racist ideologies and hateful messages. And so, as opposed to persuading others to discard, change, or better their views, to use speech to counter speech and expose bad thinking to a cleansing light, new forms of anti-racism, quite paradoxically from a liberal tradition, now position themselves in the role of the censor. From a historical perspective, this is certainly a mistake. People too often believe that they know and can anticipate what is and will continue to be right, and that they and those who think like them will always wield power. They give short shrift to how easily methods of and justifications for restrictions, once loosed, can be turned against them. Rather than striving for King's Mountaintop, where we might all enjoy equal rights under equal laws, and be maximally free to be judged by the content of our character, which is to say by what we say and do, and not by our identities or ancestries alone, which is also to admit that some of us will be found to come up lacking. That's the truth. We are instead busily burrowing into safe spaces where, along with those who look and think just like we do, we can avoid ever having to re-examine our biases. We can avoid ever having to test the real world persuasiveness and durability of our views. No matter how well-intentioned an impulse it may be, this is a problematic way of thinking, to say the least. History, after all, just like the present day, is not and cannot ever be something that always feels good. It is, however, always something that we have to try to come to grips with in order to move forward. Whether we ignore history or end up obsessing over a single aspect of it, the purpose is always to try to uncomplicate the present, to reduce it, and in the process to make oneself feel at ease. In fact, you could say that one of the great problems plaguing our society today comes down to this. Should we, for the sake of feeling good, allow ourselves to accept bad ideas, misinterpretations, distortions, and even outright lies? One can answer, yes, that's a fine thing to do, or no, it's better to refuse, or I really don't care, I'm indifferent. But that is a question all of us are faced with every day, and the way we choose to answer it will matter deeply. What I've come to realize whenever I reflect back on this nation's history and my own history within it, a history which does not always feel good and which runs back through my father to my great-great-grandfather, who was a slave in Louisiana. When I think back on all of this, what I realize is that it is my responsibility and my duty to all who came before me to do everything I can to distinguish between what is real and what is illusory, what is necessary, right, and true, and what merely makes me feel better in the moment if I believe it, which is simply to say I owe it to them to see my present situation for what it is in all its bittersweet complexity. There's a season for pessimism, but there is also a season for optimism. No matter who we are, we have to make ourselves pess-optimists, capable of flowing between both states, because life can never be perfect. We see injustice around us, and we are more aware than ever that the past is littered with it, and it feels good to tell ourselves and each other that we can once and for all eradicate it. If only we can force everyone else, everyone who is thinking incorrectly, to see things just as we do. Though it feels especially urgent today, this impulse has always been with us. The great Florentine political theorist Machiavelli cautioned us to avoid the seductive belief that it is only because lack of skill or stupidity or bad fortune that we have not so far succeeded in discovering the total solution whereby all of our interests will be brought into harmony. So long as only one ideal, whether it be social justice, wealth redistribution, or anti-racism in the new quasi-religious formulation of the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, Ibram X. Kendi, is the overarching objective, nothing will ever be too much in service of achieving that end. This is why Kendi can recommend, for example, and in all apparent seriousness, the creation of a totalitarian-sounding Department of Anti-Racism to pre-clear all local, state, and federal public policies to ensure they won't yield any racial inequity ever, and to monitor those policies, investigate private racist policies when racial inequity surfaces, and monitor public officials for expressions of racist ideas. This permanent unelected body, as he envisions it, would also be empowered with disciplinary tools to wield over and against policymakers and public officials who do not voluntarily change their racist policy and ideas, end quote. We know that our society is ailing and that the constellation of ills gathered and amplified under Trumpism has been vile. Yet we must also balance that knowledge against the understanding that the fanaticism this specific constellation of ills inspires and excuses is a form of fanaticism all the same. As a society, we have come too far to lose historical perspective and give in to the confusions of our present moment. As we stop now to celebrate another anniversary of the birth of one of our country's greatest men, as we reconnect with our painful and glorious past, we must also stop and ask ourselves if we too are willing to see ourselves and each other in all of our fullness, contradiction, and complexity. The collision between one's image of oneself and what one actually is always very painful. And there are two things you can do about it. James Baldwin, Martin Luther King's great oratorical contemporary, famously cautioned, quote, "You can meet the collision head on and try to become what you really are, or you can retreat and try to remain what you thought you were, which is a fantasy in which you will certainly perish," end quote. As so many recent events have illustrated sharply, we are still clinging to fantasies, though fortunately we haven't yet perished. As long as we're here, we'll need to find the courage to meet this collision head on. We have no other options. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for a wonderful presentation. And again, your distinct views, and we will examine some of this a little more in our panel discussion. But before we do that, we have another selection from Living Word Christian Fellowship Choir, God Bless the Lord.
Praise the Lord, everybody. Hallelujah. We come to bless the Lord this morning. I will bless the Lord. Oh, my soul. And all that is within. Come on, say bless. Bless his holy name. Come on and bless his holy name.
Thank you so very much, Living Word Christian Fellowship Choir, under the direction of Pastor John Chisholm. That was wonderful. We next turn to our panel discussion, in which we get to discuss some of the viewpoints that have been presented by RAsheda Young and by Thomas Chatterton Williams. We want to bring in our panel, and I want to introduce the panel specifically because we haven't made much mention of Rabbi Aaron Schonbrun, who's the spiritual leader of Congregation Torat L, and Pastor Cedric Miller, who is the spiritual leader of Living Word Christian Fellowship, and of course, Thomas Chatterton Williams and RAsheda Young. I'm going to make a brief disclosure that in advance of this panel discussion, I did share with the panel some of the questions that I might ask. And I also shared with them certain statistics that I might make reference to. And that is because this is not a debate. This is a conversation among people who may or may not disagree, but people who respect and I believe have a genuine like for one another. And we're going to discuss some controversial topics. And with that said, let us begin. My first question, we're in the economic area of our discussion. There is a thought experiment in modern philosophy known as the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, where we are to imagine ourselves in a state before we actually exist, knowing nothing of ourselves, our characteristics, natural abilities, or position in society. Placed in that thought experiment, with no knowledge of oneself, but with the power to choose the structure for society in which you will live once the unknown details of your life are randomly assigned, would you choose one, a system that favors a limited number of one or more groups over everyone else in order to adjust for certain random factors, or two, a system that ignores those random factors and allows each individual to apply their abilities, follow their interests, and succeed or fail by doing so? And I'm going to ask Pastor Miller to start with this question. I like to give him the easy ones.
Thank you for that. To everyone that's on here, protocol having been established, I am so honored to be around such distinguished guests. To Thomas and RAsheda, you guys were just absolutely phenomenal. Please send me your notes when you get a chance. I'd love to use them. Let's be clear that as a pastor, I have to come from a different perspective than most people would. Clearly, and I say that as a pastor because I don't have a lot of options, okay? And I think that's where the church in America has gone wrong, and especially the rogue white evangelical church, that we've given ourselves options based on culture and society and political parties and things of that nature, that as Christians, we have absolutely no such options in Scripture. So as a result, for me, this is kind of a no-brainer where I would envision a system that ignores those random factors and allows each individual to apply their abilities and follow their interests and succeed by doing so. Now, the question says succeed or fail by doing so. But as a Christian, I have a responsibility to the ones who fail in their attempt. And this idea, which I think is blasphemous, that somehow to care for those who fail or those who don't make it is somehow socialism, as opposed to central to Christian thought and practice, is really a disgrace to the body of Christ, and people should not call themselves Christians with those kind of ideologies. So I'm with two. However, I would feel a distinct, as a Christian, a distinct responsibility to the least, the last, and the left out.
Thank you, Pastor. Rabbi Schonbrun, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Just to pick up on Pastor Miller, first of all, let's get one thing. It's nice to see everybody. I see everybody's faces. I haven't seen some of my friends here for a while. Can't see all of you out in Zoom land, but it's nice to see all of you too. I think in regards to the question of faith and our responsibility, to care for other people and I'm going to say this, I think, in my remarks, but I'll say it briefly now. Later, you know, in the Hebrew scriptures, in the old, what you call the Old Testament, the scriptures that we all share, it talks about caring for people who are somehow, you know, disadvantaged, whether that disadvantage is man-made, system-made, human-made, whatever you want to say. We have a religious responsibility to do that, similar to what Pastor Miller just said. You know, in the book of Deuteronomy, they talk about the poor, the widow, the orphan, you know, and so I'll mention that a little bit later, but that just briefly, that's a brief thought, Jeff.
Okay. RAsheda, do you have any thoughts on this?
No.
Okay. Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, Rawls set the kind of ultimate trap. You'd have to be a fool going into that game blind and saying you want to bet on oligarchy or aristocracy or monarchy. I think that he found a way to make socialists of us all. There's no doubt. When you put it that way, I think that the case is clear that that we need to find ways to structure society so that there is not such extraordinary inequality. The fact is that all reality, all human life, all animal life, all plant life is on some level unequal. Things are not identical to each other, but we have to have conditions in which everybody has a chance to flourish and nobody sinks to levels that are frankly unchristian or ungodly or inhumane in a wealthy society. I happen to be talking to you from France, not the United States right now, and I've been here 10 years and I'm a parent, and it's a more socialist society than America, and one of the things that means is that it was free when my wife got pregnant and gave birth, and we have very affordable universal childcare and healthcare. And so when we go to the emergency room, it's not a situation that could potentially bankrupt a couple that are both freelance writers. We don't have to worry about how our children will be taken care of if we both pursue our careers. And so I think that there is a certain level of cruelty that is accepted in American society that I hope a thought experiment like that could get more Americans to think through why we think it's okay that since the way that the deck was shuffled, these problems don't affect us in this society, why we wouldn't imagine that we would want to create a society in which those problems didn't affect others as well.
And what role, let me just add one thing, and what role, you know, does a society have, right? And who is that society, and who is that community, and what is that structure to help, you know, individuals who are in need in whatever way they're in need. Tonight we're talking about issues of race, but you know that I think is a really important question to this whole conversation too.
Well, as a follow-up question on what you raised, Rabbi, should we treat people as individuals or members of a group?
Yes.
Yeah, we should treat people as individuals or members of a group.
Not or. Yes, it's a false binary.
And okay. Well, let me.
Jeff?
RAsheda, go ahead.
The question, should we treat them as separate or as a whole? My experience as a Black woman has been that we are treated as a whole, as opposed to an individual. My experience as a Black woman is that I am representative of my race instead of being an individual within my race. So from personal experience, it has been that I am treated as a whole, where my counterparts that I have seen and I have witnessed and I've fictionalized or fantasized about are treated more as individuals and less, and that they're given more opportunities to be an individual than to be reflective of their race. So I wanted to add on to that from personal experiences, having been through many different, that's verbose, but having been through different ranks at a collegiate level, in academia, I have seen the ways in which we are treated, and it is different. period, as we say with a T.
Let me follow up with this question. Which of these goals should be pursued by a just society? Equality of opportunity, equality of outcome, or both? Anybody have any thoughts? Thomas?
Sure. I'd just like to jump on that previous question very quickly and just say that, you know, being treated as an individual or being treated as a representative of a group, you know, what racism does is it puts a kind of veil of myth and stereotype between you and the person you're interacting with, and doesn't allow you to see who the person is in their complexity as an individual. You apply a collective dynamic to that individual, and that's always a kind of injury to the person. I think that there's tremendous pride to be had in the group, but when a collective identity is imposed and you're not allowed to be seen for who you are on an individual basis, that's a kind of injustice in society. And so I think the society we want to get to is one in which group characteristics are less salient and in which we can be proud of them, but we're not bound by them. So that's one thing. And the equality of opportunity, equality of outcome debate, you know, it's one that's really come roaring back. And again, I think that, you know, you have to take into account historical injustices that have been done. It's impossible to believe that we can just say, we're going to start from zero and it's all good now.
Right.
I think that, you know, my father is 83 years old. He was born in 1937 in Longview, Texas. He was 27 years old or something before he could drink at the same water fountain as my mother could if she were to be in that town passing through. I mean, he's been in a situation in which, like many people still living today, he was unable to buy homes in certain neighborhoods. And you can do the math on what that means in opportunity cost and things like this. There is some amount of reparation that makes sense to me. There's kinds of affirmative action that certainly make sense to me when you take into account historical wrongs that have been done. Where I get uncomfortable when we talk about equality of outcome is when we get into conversations where it seems as though we're talking about in perpetuity, we permanently have to engineer outcomes because some groups are considered unable to ever compete with other groups by standardized measures. That's when you're essentially accepting the logic of the white supremacist or the racist, and you're deeming one group fundamentally inferior to another, and that makes me deeply uncomfortable.
And can the government take responsibility though for a group? Because a number of you have raised this idea of disadvantages through history, and people are not starting from the same place, and that leaves some responsibility in your response to government. So my question is, can government take the responsibility for a group and succeed in providing individuals within that group dignity, personal goals, and a drive to succeed through financial distributions and policies geared to favor that group over others? Or does all of those goals and all of those successes have to come from someplace else? Pastor Miller.
Thank you. Again, when you're talking about the historical context of American culture, for the government not to take some responsibility for that is cruel. The level of dismissiveness, cluelessness, and historical amnesia that would be required to do any such thing is beyond human understanding. And I'm not saying that responsibility won't rest within individuals and groups for their personal lives. But the truth of the matter is, if somebody doesn't have ambition, it wasn't because he woke up one day and says, I'm not going to have ambition. He was raised in a culture and in a climate that fostered his lack of ambition. I have ambition because I happen to be raised in a home outside of the United States of America, where without dad ever sitting down and says, I'm going to teach you Ambition 101, it was woven into the fabric of everyday life, just getting up and going home. My dad had a third grade education and was a successful businessman. However, when you put somebody in this kind of an oppressive system for centuries and then just look up one day and says, well, everybody should be given the opportunity. And if they don't take advantage of it, it's up to them, and so forth and so on, without thinking of how they got to this point and that others benefited from how they got to this point, is something that is absolutely unconscionable. And to have that kind of a decision or that kind of conversation now and feel okay with that is something, again, I'm saying any civil, of course, I'm a pastor, so I'm always going to be speaking from the church's perspective, and especially in 2021, where the church has lost its soul, the idea that anybody with any kind of Christian morals would ever subscribe to something like that. You know, quickly, when you see Jesus dealing with the lost, the least, the left out, and so forth and so on, he's dealing with their current condition, not the cause of how they got there.
Right.
And
so,
we have to be right. We have to be careful that if we're going to name his name, we must follow his example and don't create our own.
And I would say, you know, to pick up on that, you know, and I appreciate hearing from our panelists on this, but, you know, from what I'm understanding, you know, in as much as I can understand it, as a white Jewish privileged rabbi, okay, right? From what I understand in terms of where things are at, in terms of racial inequality in our country still, there may be an ideal vision of what people want, of seeing everybody in God's image, of all this religious language we would use and share, but they're also, you know, but what are the facts on the ground, and where are you starting from, which is what Pastor Miller just said. Where are you starting from, and how do you acknowledge where you're starting from and deal with, you know, inequality that exists, right? And to take it again, just the example that keeps coming to my mind in terms of my scripture from Deuteronomy, you know, there's been inequality. In that case, it wasn't about race; it was economics, when you talked about the poor and the widow, and you know, but it existed, and you had to deal with it. You couldn't just pretend it didn't exist and say, well, isn't that fine, right?
What do we say to certain intellectuals who've done extensive writing, like Shelby Steele and Glenn Lurie, who say that the civil rights movement economic process was sacrificed by unexpected, untoward events of bad policy from the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, because what the community needs is equality of opportunity, or as close as we can get to that, but then using that opportunity to move forward and do the hard work and do the self-reliance and take the steps to actually succeed in their own terms. And until that's done, there will always be a gap in income between people of color as a group and many people who are Caucasian or of other extractions. Thomas, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. Glenn Lowry is, you know, somebody that's made me think quite a lot on these issues as I've gotten to know him over the years. I'll give you an example. You know, what we talk about when we talk about systemic racism, it's a term that's kind of been used so much. It's not that it doesn't refer to anything real in society, but it can be used in situations and contexts that need much more parsing out than a blanket term like that can really do. And I'll give you one example from recent years, even from last year, that I think about often. It's to do with the entrance exam to the cluster of elite public schools in New York City. So Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, Brooklyn Tech, and a handful of others. That is a situation that gets interesting when you do so-called racial breakdowns too, because it's not white kids who are on top there. Hasn't been for a while. It's Asian kids who are on top, a variety of different ethnicities, but a lot of them happen to be Chinese and Korean from parts of Queens usually. Oftentimes they're first generation or second generation immigrants, but not always. And quite often they're poor and extremely poor even. And English is not their first language. New York City provides test prep services to all students who want them, but oftentimes Asian students take test prep within their neighborhoods privately and pay for it. And Mayor de Blasio has said that, you know, the number of students who get into these schools in a city that is so diverse as New York is unrepresentative, and therefore, in the kind of Kendian way of framing the question, is necessarily an instance of systemic racism.
Okay.
The New York Times, well, I didn't know, I'm sorry, the New York Times, in covering this, had an article that I think cuts to the heart of the matter of what we're talking about. And we can't talk about these things if things like culture are now verboten. So the Times, in covering this topic, basically took de Blasio's line, except in interviewing some of the Asian families, as a throwaway line in the piece. 6-7 paragraphs in, they said, some of the Chinese families go without meals to pay for their extra help cram courses, and that's how they study, and that's how they beat the white kids, and that's how they outperform them. That's not systemic racism. That's a choice. That's a culture. There's a lot of factors that go into a community prioritizing putting their kids into extra help study sessions instead of eating certain meals. And I don't think we can ever, this is straight Glenn Larry, I don't think we can ever, if what we want to do is actually equalize outcomes, if what we want to do is make sure that everybody thrives, I don't think we can get to that without addressing whatever it is in the atmosphere that leads certain groups to do certain behaviors that work in this competitive society, and other groups, for whatever the reasons are, whether fair or not to do those things.
May I add on to that, please?
Yes, quickly, because I want to move on to another area. Go ahead.
Okay, quick is structural forces. That's the end.
Okay.
Hey, a little more, RAsheda. Can I hear a little more? I was interested to hear what you say. Can we give her another minute, Jeff?
Sure.
Okay. I think we need to look at, if we're looking at culture, if we're looking at food, we need to keep in mind the structural forces that enable certain groups to have access. If we do not look at the structural forces that are in play, we're going to think it leads us to this idea of meritocracy. And the idea, like, if you just work hard and if you just study, and you, no, we need to look at the structural forces that are in play, that have been in play, that have enabled certain groups to have more access than those who do not. And
well, that's why I was specifically using a group that has no access, which would be a first-generation Chinese immigrant family where the father's a dishwasher in a kitchen, and the son is English as a second language student, and they're skipping meals to pay. That's the opposite of a structural advantage.
Well, actually, if you look at immigrants, we are still considered, and we are still treated as though we're immigrants, speaking for me, in our own country. And so if you take the Chinese dishwasher, he or she hasn't had the same structural experiences in America as someone like me has experienced here as an American.
Well, can I just say something real quick before you move on?
Yes,
Jeff?
you're boxing me out of my next topic, but go ahead, Pastor.
Okay, great. Because one of the issues, even though we talk about access, well, we must also talk about access to belief. And I'm not talking about belief from a faith perspective, but I know, it's like I had a conversation with somebody the other day, and think about this. The emotional or the psychological lift that African Americans received when in 2008, when Barack Obama became president, right? The psychological and emotional lift that African Americans received. I'm from someplace that I've always had that lift. I wasn't raised in an oppressive society, so I always believed that I could rise to the top, and therefore it would be normal for my family to say, let's skip a few meals, because if you do this, this, and this, it will lead to these outcomes. But when you put somebody in a culture such as these United States of America, many times in the African American community, there is no such belief that making those kind of sacrifices will lead to those outcomes. And so when we start talking about equality of opportunity, we have work to do even before we get to that step to instill that level of belief and faith and hope and ambition in people.
There was a little.
I want to get one law enforcement question in, and then I want to go to Thomas's issue that he wrote a whole book about. And because we're observing a 30-minute time frame, I'm not going to be able to do that. So let me just ask my one question very quickly. I did provide some statistics, which, by the way, came from the Washington Post, CNN, and the FBI reports for 2019 and 2020. But in 2019, we had a circumstance where there were 55 individuals unarmed who were killed by the police, and 13 of them were of color. 25 of them were Caucasian, and 17 of them were of other extractions, might be Asian, Hispanic, etc. My one question is, we see reports of Americans of color when they are killed by police on a routine basis. We do not see reports of the 25 Caucasians killed, or even the 17 individuals of other extractions being killed. Let me finish the question. My question is there a bias? Is there a bias in the reporting of these incidents that enables the country to believe that this problem is predominantly African American and does not affect other groups of individuals? RAsheda, do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I was just going to Jonathan Mesel's book, Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland, where he talks about that, where he actually says, like, there's a term, you have complexion for the protection. And based upon your complexion, different laws are made. What he says in his book is that actually in Missouri, you have more white on white crime. You have more partner deaths. You have more killing that are done, actually, he says, by whites than blacks, but yet it is painted as though blacks are the miscreants and blacks are the ones who are out there doing the killing. And so he goes in this discussion about the NRA and such. So my point is that based upon the way that you look at the statistics and the way in which they are painted and presented, you can make the case that I don't know, I haven't done the research that you've done. You can make the case that there are whites who do die while in custody with police officers. But from my research and what I know as a Black woman who is raising a Black son, there is a very different level of awareness that we all have, that I know that my white friends do not have. We know the fear when we see the police sirens versus, and we might not even be doing any, we could very well not be doing anything wrong, but it's this feeling that we feel. And so I'm not familiar with the statistics that you just mentioned. However, I do know that every time I look around, there is someone who is dying unnecessarily while in police custody.
And my follow-up question to you is that exacerbated, that feeling, by a lack of complete reporting in the press of other deaths by the hands of police, and not just people of color that are usually reported. Is that bias in reporting adding to your feeling?
No.
Absolutely not.
I didn't know if that was for me, the follow-up, but absolutely not. Because we cannot erase the historical, the historical accounting of Blacks being lynched, with audiences pointing at the bodies and laughing, with a Black person being accused or diagnosed with drapetomania for wanting to escape slavery. So these things, the historical, I mean, like the facts do not lie. Like people got dressed up to go to lynchings. This isn't, I made this up. These are facts. So
but we are talking about today though, not 1860.
No. You can't talk about today without talking about yesterday. It's like a continuum.
All right. One of the problems here is that we don't have enough time, and this is a deep subject, and we're just scratching the surface. But I wanted to leave a few minutes to ask Thomas a question so that you can all comment on. Can we recognize race as a social construct that lacks any biological differences, and therefore ignore race as a factor in assessing each individual while preserving and acknowledging cultural contributions from every source? And since Thomas wrote a book about this, I'd like to have him go first, and then we can all join in. Thomas?
Sure. Well, you know, a lot of what we've been talking about all night is what Barbara and Karen Fields, two scholars that I admire very much, who wrote a book called Racecraft in 2012, call racecraft. Oftentimes we talk about a lot of complex dynamics in society, whether it be class, whether it be health outcomes, whether it be interactions with the criminal justice system. And there's a variety of factors involved, and we call it race. I don't deny, and I wouldn't, I would never make the case that racism is not a factor in 2021, or that we can simply close our eyes and pretend that everybody's the same and we don't see color and that things would suddenly be fine. Am I breaking up? I can't tell.
Okay.
You can
okay, keep going.
So I think we have to do really two things at once, and it's not an either or bargain. We have to be opposed to the racism that functions in our societies now, as our societies really are, because they are not the ideal that we hope them to be. They are not the perfect union that we're trying to get to. The arc of the moral universe hasn't arrived at its end yet. But I do think that we have to keep our eye on where that arc is going. And I think that we have to keep our eye on a much larger goal than simply opposing racism and accepting the inevitability that we belong to separate racial groups, even as we pay lip service to the idea that these are not genetically, scientifically valid categories. I think we have to keep our eye always on the goal of eradicating race as a category of dividing human beings. And I will say the reason why is not just high-minded and moral, it's pragmatic. I don't think that you can salvage these categories. They come out of the collision of Europe and Africa in the New World through the slave trade. They come out of a domination that's about 400 or 500 years old, not that old in the history of civilized life, but old enough that it feels as though we can't imagine our world without them. But Black, white, racialized identities in this society necessarily imply a hierarchy, and racism is a function of these categories. And so the two are intertwined. You can't purge the categories of all that makes them wrong and hold on to something that's good, and it doesn't work that way. And you know, the cliche that you can't take down the master's house with his own tools is apt here. We have to actually be much bolder in our thinking and try to imagine new ways of conceiving of ourselves and each other.
Thank you, Thomas.
I just want to let Pastor Miller was going to say something before, so if we can just let him, or maybe respond to Thomas, but also.
I was going to go to Pastor Miller.
I'll do this real quickly. Just to go back up to the previous point, it kind of is not apples to apples when you're talking about killings by the police in America, just from the math, right? In terms of numbers, it will always be more white being killed by the police. So it's not killings to killings. it's killings, this frivolous killings is the issue. It's killings compared to unprovoked killings. That's the issue. Quick example. I flew out to Albuquerque. I bought a car, got stopped twice on the way back, and got asked the same question twice. What do you do to afford that car? Right? And that could have gone all kinds of ways. And the second one, I said, just out of curiosity, sir, what is your level of education? And he said, not that I need to answer. And he answered, I said, I have 6 children and they're all more educated than you. Maybe you should not ask me what I do. So to compare the numbers is not a fair thing, because they may die more because it's more of them, but they're not dying for selling loose cigarettes. We see them just in Patterson, New Jersey the other day. A dude is waving a gun and the cops are hiding behind the pole. So we're calling to see who he is and to get information. And he's pointing the gun and it's a 45-minute standoff. I guarantee you, if that was me, I would have been dead 40 minutes ago. That is just the reality of it. And we're not being true to ourselves if we want to have that discussion and act as if, maybe there's just as many whites being killed. It could be. There's 334 million of us. It's a very 17% of us that look like me. Clearly the number is going to work, but we are dying for absolutely no reason whatsoever. My home was broken into a few summers ago, and it was, where I live in Millstone Township. And before I called the police, I had to make sure that my whole family is in one room with all the lights on, that there wouldn't be an assumption that if a police officer came in and saw one of my Black kids roaming around in this neighborhood, he would assume that that is the person that broke in, that he's looking. So the reality is very different. And I don't think we're helping ourselves if we just look at the numbers to say, well, there are many whites that are being killed by the police, and so maybe the media is hyping it up and so forth and so on. No, it's no comparison.
Okay, but again, the problem is we need a lot more time to discuss these things, and we're now run out of time on this panel discussion, and I want to preserve the rabbi's opportunity to sum up. But I want to thank each of you for participating in the panel discussion, and I appreciate your answers. I wish that we could get together more frequently and discuss these things more thoroughly, but like Winston Churchill said, it's not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, but perhaps it is the end of the beginning. And hopefully we're making progress. I know that all of us want to see that progress. Rabbi, we're going to have, after your summation, I just want to announce that Living Word Christian Fellowship is going to do, as we always do, several verses from We Shall Overcome, and we're going to end up with America the Beautiful. But at this point, it is your floor to sum up and have us understand the issues and perhaps a way forward.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you, Jeff, so much for all of your work, and I want to thank Pastor Miller, our friends at Living Word Christian Fellowship, Reverend Gibson, who unfortunately, as we know, was unable to be with us, friends at Second Baptist Church. And as I said to Pastor Miller earlier, I want to share a special wish for healing to those in his community, family who are dealing with COVID outbreak. Our thoughts and prayers continue to be with you for a speedy recovery during this challenging times. And I want to say, it's hard doing this without seeing everybody, but know that, that good feeling that we have for those who are together every year, even when we engage in topics that may bring up challenging emotions, is here. And so even though we can't see each other's eyes and we can't sort of feel each other's energy, we are, I know, together. I want to thank our Professor RAsheda Young and Thomas Chatterton Williams for being with us, in particular since it's like, 2 a.m. in Paris. I want to thank the Beth Sholom Foundation. And I want to acknowledge that it's a difficult time that we're in as a country as we honor Dr. King. And we engage tonight in a topic that is sensitive and critical to discuss in a country that remains so very divided. We did so amidst the backdrop of racial tensions that have been inflamed, brought to a boiling point in recent months, thanks to those who would seek to sow the seeds of hate and divisiveness rather than seeds of love and peace and mutual respect and understanding. And we did so as America begins a new chapter in her history that I know all of us hope will bring us closer instead of driving us further and further apart. Now, this past summer, when protests erupted across the country, they did so for a noble cause, a just and a spiritual cause, and a cause that Dr. King spoke of in his words as a pastor quite often. They did so because Black Lives Matter, something that should be said clearly with no qualifier. They did so because the cause of justice, the cause that demands that, in the words of the prophet Amos, justice roll down like the waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, is one to be pursued. And they did so because, as our shared text from Deuteronomy says, you say in Hebrew, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue. The word is repeated, by the way, for emphasis, and at least one Jewish commentator says it means that justice should be pursued to create a fair court system. Isn't that interesting? As a religious leader and as a person of faith, I speak, like Pastor Miller, I come from a faith tradition, and that's where I'm going to start. As a father, as a member of this interfaith group, thinking of all this and witnessing the events of this summer, I decided earlier in the summer, as a white Jewish male, I needed to do some reading and some listening and some educating myself. And I was really glad to have more of that opportunity tonight, listening to our speakers. I read books like The New Jim Crow that RAsheda talked about a couple of years ago. It took me a while, RAsheda, but I got there. Blood of Emmett Till, How to Be an Anti-Racist, Stamp by Kendi that we spoke about tonight. And I spent much of the summer reading and thinking, and why did I do that? Because I knew I couldn't grow personally or help our society live up to some of our shared biblical and faith ideals if I didn't have an understanding, or at least the beginning of the understanding, of the racial challenges that we're facing in this country. And I wondered how I could claim and preach that everyone's made in God's image if I wasn't willing to really explore how many individuals and even some systems unfortunately fail to live up to that religious gold standard intentionally and unintentionally. I had to read and listen and hear stories, just like the brief story that we just heard from our friend Pastor Miller. And so I began to educate myself and continue to strive to become the person that my Jewish tradition asks me to be, and the person that Dr. King asked all of us to become. A person who values the common humanity found in all of us, while recognizing our differences that are to be both celebrated and understood, in particular when they cause inequities. And that's what I think Thomas was mentioning earlier when he said we have to deal with our inequities, even if we're not sure, how far the differences will take us. And it's this last point and much of what we discussed tonight that gets to the heart of an issue I want to highlight just from a religious perspective. The question of whether or not we are sacred individuals all made in God's image, or whether we are distinct as identified by our religion, or in this case, race, is a trick question. That's why, Jeff, much earlier I said yes. If I am white or black or Muslim or Christian or Jewish, am I also part of the human family? Of course I am. But there's something very important about holding on to, about honoring our distinctiveness, even as we celebrate our shared universal connection to the one who is the creator of all. You ever wonder why the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, starts with the universal story, the creation of the world, Adam and Eve, Noah, the flood, and not the Israelites' journey out of slavery to freedom? According to Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who passed away this year, he taught that there are actually two covenants in the Bible, one who honors our common humanity and the other our particularity and our diversity. We are not the same, he said. There is us and them, but God is universal and particular, which means that God can be found among us as well as among them. He writes, the test of faith is whether I can make space for difference. Can I recognize God in someone who is not in my image, whose language, faith, ideal are different than mine? If I cannot recognize that, then I have made God in my image instead of allowing him to remake me in his. When my white Jewish community, for example, fails to call out or even see racial inequality, we end up consciously or unconsciously making God in our image, instead of recognizing that we are all made in God's image, in all of its diverse glory. Just look at some classic European art, Christian art. When we say, for example, that Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean that all lives don't matter. Of course they do. It's simply to say that a distinct group must be treated by individuals and by systems as people who matter, because all too often the painful reality is that they and you are not. Again, as we heard some of tonight. All too often, people or systems, consciously and unconsciously, end up limiting God's image. When all is said and done, or at least as much as can happen on Zoom these days, like Jeff just said, where do we want to end up? As we gather during these difficult times, on so many levels aware of the tremendous progress that has been made and aware of the tremendous work yet to be done, where are we trying to go? In our Jewish Bible reading cycle, this is the week where the ancient Israelites crossed through the turbulent waters of the Sea of Reeds with Moses and Miriam, leading them to the Promised Land. So where's our Promised Land? I recently came across a piece written by Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson, a prominent thinker in my denomination, who reminded us of a teaching in the Jewish tradition that the world stands on three virtues: on justice, on truth, and on peace. He explained, and I will quote, "Our goal must be a society in which someone's race doesn't matter and yet matters very much. That is, vis-a-vis one's right as a citizen, one's race should be irrelevant, but as a matter of identity, culture, and pride, one's race and community matters equally for each citizen and deserves honor and attention from society at large. The twin poles of legal irrelevance and cultural prominence direct us towards the end of our journey, towards which our effort must point. A commitment to the standard of truth requires," he says, "recognition that while most Americans oppose racism, the culture marinated in a racist belief and practice for so long that we are all infected by its residue," which is something actually that all of our speakers said tonight. We are all infected by a racism that seeps out of our subconscious, our assumptions, our split-second reactions. Even though pretty much all of us are opposed to racism, the residue, he says, remains just under the surface, or I would say not so under the surface, as we saw just a few weeks ago. These words were written in 2016. To acknowledge these truths, he continues, is not to foment a race war, is simply to root ourselves in truth. America is not yet a level playing field, and the truth requires us to acknowledge that there is much work yet to do. Justice, says Rabbi Artson, requires that we keep the goal of equality and diversity and shared values firmly in place. But truth requires acknowledging the chasm between what ought to be and what is. And peace reflects the American conviction that the locus of value lies in each individual person. That's a very important sentence. Justice requires we keep the goal of equality, diversity, and shared values in place. Truth requires acknowledging the chasm between what ought to be and what is. And peace reflects the conviction in America that the locus of value lies in each individual. If liberty is built one person at a time, then we must respect the rights of every person, starting with their right to life, to security, to well-being. A republic depends on the rule of law, a law that reflects equity and justice for all. My friends, I want to thank you so much for gathering here tonight. As Rabbi Artson writes, and as all of us here tonight understand, many far better than I, as Americans, we have both come so very far and yet have such a long way to go. But in the end, in particular tonight, we'll strive to believe, Thomas and I didn't consult on this, but he started with it and I'll end it with it. Dr. King so famously said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Let us never lose hope, as Dr. King preached shortly before he was taken from this world much too soon, that we as a people will eventually get to the promised land. And so I conclude tonight with the hope and prayer that we as people of faith will continue to gather in common cause, celebrating our shared divine humanity, while recognizing and seeking to understand our real difference of experience in this country, as we work to pursue a world in which truth and justice and peace are the foundations of our great democracy, as we work to pursue a world in which God, whose symbol of peace to Noah was a multicolored rainbow, is recognized in the variety of shades and colors found in God's most precious creation, each one of us. There's a blessing we say every morning in our tradition. Baruch atah Adonai pokeach ivrim. We praise God who gives us the gift of opening our eyes. My prayer is that all of us tonight be blessed to see clearly the blessings and challenges that are before us as we daily strive to honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I thank you all so very much for joining us tonight. Jeff, I turn it now back over to you and to our final choral pieces. Everybody get up and sing.
Thank you, Rabbi, for an inspiring summation on our program for tonight. I'd like to introduce or reintroduce the Living Word Christian Fellowship Choir singing selected verses of We Shall Overcome and God Bless America. And good night, everybody.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome.
not afraid. Someday we shall live in peace. 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 Someday. Oh, deep in my heart. Oh, I do believe that we shall live in peace someday. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of rain, for purple mountains, majesty above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea